So as Dan Horan mentioned, the title of my talk is Contemplation in Times of Crisis. It probably goes without saying that we live in a time of crisis. Although the COVID-19 pandemic is presently waning in the United States, thanks to the distribution of vaccines, it is still raging in many other parts of the world and has claimed as many as 4 million lives worldwide. It has exacerbated already deep racial and international inequalities. For many individuals, COVID-19 was an extra burden added to the top of an already high pile of troubles having to do with physical and mental health challenges, strained relationships, financial instabilities and hardships, and in some cases outright oppression. Black people who live in poor neighborhoods in this country face a daily risk of violence both from criminal organizations and from the police whose supposed job is to prevent crime. Absurdly, whether their lives matter at all has become a topic of public debate. But even if one says Black Lives Matter and puts this message on social media or a t-shirt or a bumper sticker, one is still unlikely to have workable solutions to the manifold problems that poor Black communities face. Meanwhile, the waters are rising. Each summer is hotter than the last. Animal and plant species are being exterminated. Highly populated parts of the world are becoming unlivable. And we seem to lack the collective political will to make the needed changes. Christians are, moreover, complicit in all of these problems. It may either be comforting or disconcerting to recall that Thomas Merton lived in a time of crisis as well. His autobiography, The Seven-Story Mountain, begins in this way. Quote, "On the last day of January 1915, under the sign of the water bearer, in a year of great war, and down in the shadow of some French mountains on the borders of Spain, I came into the world. Free by nature, in the image of God, I was nevertheless the prisoner of my own violence and my own selfishness, in the image of the world into which I was born. That world was the picture of hell, full of men like myself, loving God and yet hating him, born to love him, living instead in fear and hopeless self-contradictory hungers," end quote. The backdrop to Merton's infancy was the horror of the First World War, men in trenches being shot and blown to bits, all in the name of some supposed national self-interest. Merton would also live through the Second World War, in which he would lose his younger brother, John Paul, and the first decades of the so-called Cold War, which in fact became extremely hot and deadly and prolonged proxy wars throughout Latin America, Africa, and Asia. He witnessed extraordinary technological achievements that promised progress for society, but also brought the threat of universal destruction, particularly through the proliferation of nuclear arms. In the United States, where he spent most of his childhood and adult life, he observed the injustices of Jim Crow society, including not only segregation, but also lynching, political disenfranchisement, economic deprivation, and many other kinds of violent treatment in both the South and the North, inflicted on people who were at the time called Negroes. He was inspired by the moral heroism of the civil rights movement and disheartened by the moral failings of many white Christians who refused its calls to conversion. In addition to deepening his dialogue with East Asian contemplative traditions, especially Zen Buddhism, he spent the last years of his life reflecting on the volatile racial conflicts of the 1960s. He wrote about the rise of Black Power movements, which filled him with some ambivalence, and he wrote about the reactionary responses to them by white Christian conservatives and liberals alike, which he condemned as cowardly and unchristian. Merton often used the Greek word kairos, which is prominent in the New Testament, to speak about a time of crisis that calls for a very significant decision. He once asked, quote, can Christians recognize their kairos? That is, are they capable of making bold and necessary choices to address the violent circumstances of their societies and of their own souls? Merton was not confident that Christians would be up to the task. Indeed, he had severe doubts. Even if they had the right doctrines in their mind, he understood that they were, as a group and as individuals, not better than anyone else, just as prone to go through their lives with hardened hearts and depraved indifference to the suffering of others. Merton looked around and saw plainly that the world was a violent place. He believed that this violence started deep inside each of us, and that Christians were no exception to that rule. He lamented this fact because he thought that Christians ought to know better and to do better. If they were actually living their faith consistently, they would be Christ-like in their actions and would revere the presence of Christ in others. They would recognize everyone immediately as a brother or sister, a fellow child of God, and approach them with a spirit of self-giving love. Instead, Merton saw Christians approaching fellow human beings with fear, hostility, and blatant disregard for their own and for others' humanity. In Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, Merton recounts an incident in which several white Catholics at a parish in New Orleans left the church during the middle of a homily. These regular churchgoers, faithful Catholics all, were outraged by the priest's suggestion that Jesus' command to love your neighbor as yourself disallowed their segregationist practices. In Merton's judgment, the lesson to be learned from this story is that, quote, one can think himself a good Catholic and be thought one by his neighbors, and still be, in effect, an apostate from the Christian faith, end quote. According to Merton, anti-Black racism is a form of apostasy. It is an abdication of the sort of life that Christ demands that Christians live. Merton wanted to help his readers see that the time was running out for them to make a real choice for Christ, and thus for a new way of living in deep communion and solidarity with one another. But he was not optimistic that they would heed his warning and embrace this kairos moment. The central insight that I take from Merton's writings is that our social and political crises, such as war, racism, poverty, ecological destruction, and so forth and so on, are deeply rooted in our malformed spiritual lives. He is convinced that these crises must be addressed at this deeper level if we are ever going to make any real headway on them. He offers contemplation as a way to target the roots of the world's greatest problems. This perspective might seem simplistic or naive, especially given the moral failings of Christians and others who might claim to practice contemplation, failings of which Merton was painfully aware, as we have seen. Nevertheless, I believe there is some real truth in his thesis. In what follows, in my remarks this evening, I first clarify my understanding of what Merton means by contemplation and how he strives to balance tensions between the will and the intellect, solitude and society, eternity and history. I then discuss Merton's relationship with his brother John Paul, whose untimely death created a personal crisis for Merton in the early years of his contemplative practice. I contend that this relationship may provide a clue to the sort of brotherly love that Merton argues is an essential feature of true contemplation. I show how this love shapes Merton's engagement with crises involving the unjust treatment of African Americans, which continue in new and familiar forms today. And I also suggest ways that it may be extended to address our contemporary ecological disasters. All in all, I argue that contemplation, as Merton understands it, does have the potential to provide much of what this crisis-ridden world desperately needs. So in short, I think he's right, but we have to understand what he was really saying. So the first part of my talk here is called The Meaning and Tensions of Contemplation. In his book, New Seeds of Contemplation, Merton defines contemplation in general terms as, quote, a vivid realization of the fact that life and being in us proceed from an invisible, transcendent, and infinitely abundant source, end quote. A few pages later, he gives a more particular Christian definition, citing St. Paul's letter to the Galatians. He writes, quote, "Contemplation is the awareness and realization, even in some sense experience, of what each Christian obscurely believes. It is now no longer I that live, but Christ who lives in me." This is Galatians 2:20, end quote. Merton says that in contemplation we discover our real selves, the, quote, "hidden and mysterious persons in whom we," end quote. He adds that contemplation distinguishes this true God-given identity from our superficial or exterior selves, the egos that are products of our greed, pettiness, or pride. Contemplation is not primarily an activity on our part. It is not a skill to be acquired or an object to be possessed. It is the grace of God working within us, opening us to higher forms of consciousness, freedom, and love. Merton dedicated his life to this great mystery of contemplation. This dedication is made evident in one way by the fact that he chose to become a Cistercian of the strict observance, that is, a Trappist, joining the Abbey of Our Lady of Gethsemani in central Kentucky in 1941. However, his writing about contemplation was not meant only for other monks, whether they be Christian or not. Nor was his goal merely to attract others to his monastic way of life. He was interested in helping lay persons, Christians or otherwise, grow in awareness of the divine presence that was already within them. Merton's belief in this universal but also very deeply personal and intimate divine presence follows logically from his belief in the Christian doctrine of the Incarnation. He writes, quote, "For in becoming man, God became not only Jesus Christ, but also potentially every man and woman that ever existed. In Christ, God became not only this man, but also in a broader and more mystical sense, yet no less truly every man," end quote. Although monks like Merton are empowered to focus on contemplation in a particular way because of their vocation, contemplation is in fact meant for everyone. It is a gift of union between God and the human soul, which is accomplished in Christ, and which calls to each of us in whatever concrete circumstances we may find ourselves. Although contemplation includes a more vibrant and life-giving awareness of God, it does not turn God into a comprehensible object or render the contemplative omniscient. It is as much an experience of not knowing as it is of knowing, because one's finite intellect simply cannot contain the infinite divine wellspring that overflows within. Nevertheless, Merton proceeds with caution here. He insists that true contemplation is not anti-intellectual. He is worried about the threat of a false mysticism, perceptible in the frenzied political movements of National Socialism and totalitarian communism, which abandons the intellect in favor of, quote, "a blind life force or power considered sometimes as beyond man, sometimes as within himself," end quote. Following John of the Cross and other daring mystics of the dark night, Merton associates the perfection of contemplation with a state of pure love that greatly surpasses what any earthly reason can understand. At the same time, as a very careful student of Thomas Aquinas, Merton also stresses that this is a state of love and not mere blind will, and that such love is inseparable from a gift of divine wisdom and a life of well-ordered habitual holiness. Merton is highly critical of any religious, political, or erotic enthusiasm that would prize ecstatic experience for its own sake and untether it from the concrete ways of life that Christ teaches us to follow, and that we also learn to obey through our consciences and through the natural law. In addition to holding the tensions between intellect and will in the mystery of love, Merton also argues that true contemplation must maintain a close bond between solitude and society. He says, quote, "Physical solitude, exterior silence, and real recollection are all morally necessary for anyone who wants to lead a contemplative life." But he adds that, quote, "We do not go into the desert to escape people, but to learn how to find them, end quote. By filling us with divine love, contemplation frees us to share this love with others and to find this love already radiant in them. Excuse me if I keep quoting Merton at length, but he has such a way with words, especially on this topic. He writes, quote, "The more we are alone, the more we are together. And the more we are in society, the true society of charity, not of cities and crowds, the more we are alone with Christ. For in my soul and in your soul, I find the same Christ who is our life, and he finds himself in our love, and together we all find paradise, which is the sharing of his love for his Father in the person of their Spirit." The other passage I want to reproduce in this context is a famous one describing an experience Merton had on the corner of 4th and Walnut. After his most memorable line, "There is no way of telling people that they are all walking around shining like the sun," he adds, quote, "This changes nothing in the sense and value of my solitude. For it is in fact a function of solitude to make one realize such things with a clarity that would be impossible to anyone completely immersed in other cares, the other illusions, and all the automatisms of a tightly collective existence. My solitude, however, is not my own, for I see now how much it belongs to them, and that I have a responsibility for it in their regard, not just in my own. It is because I am one with them that I owe it to them to be alone. And when I am alone, they are not they, but my own self. There are no strangers," he adds with an exclamation point. Therefore, it is quite clear that any pursuit of contemplation that amounted to a mere practice of navel-gazing or self-absorption would be counted a failure on Merton's grounds. To find God within is to find the truer version of ourselves that does not relate to others with self-interested motives or recoil from them out of fear, but rather relates to them with deep warmth and understanding and Christ-like commitment. Finally, true contemplation is distinguished for Merton by its concrete grappling with history. Although he acknowledges the eternity of God, he also emphasizes that Christianity is, quote, "the salvation of man in and through history, through temporal decisions made for Christ, the Redeemer and Lord of history," end quote. Merton argues that there are kairos moments which test and reveal the extent to which one has let the love of God reinvigorate one's interior life and transform it from a hardened condition of sin to a liberated condition of grace. The seeds of contemplation are planted by every historical experience one undergoes, and the question is only whether one will let them grow and bear fruit. That is, when the time of decision comes, when one has to take a stand against violence and injustice, and perhaps even risk one's life struggling for a more peaceful society, will one make the right choice? Will one's soul have become so verdant and fresh, so alive with divine compassion, that it will freely respond in the just and courageous ways that it must? Or will it rather shrivel and cower and become lifeless? As long as we exist in this world, contemplation does not relieve us of the burden to wrestle with historical crises. On the contrary, it compels us to face them head on. So that's my understanding, basically, of what Merton means by contemplation and the various tensions that he tries to hold as he theorizes it. The next and more substantive part of my talk is called the Crises and Metamorphoses of Fraternal Love. Merton learns this lesson about the inescapable historical context of contemplation in a very poignant way through his relationship with his brother, John Paul. Memories of his brother are scattered throughout the autobiography. He talks about summers on Long Island in the mid-1930s when John Paul was home from school, and they, quote, "had nothing to do but go swimming and hang around the house playing hot records," end quote. They would walk to the movies and see whatever was showing, however dismal in quality it may have been. He talks about visiting John Paul at college several years later. His brother was a student at Cornell in Ithaca, New York. At this point, Merton had already developed a deep Catholic faith and was planning to join the Franciscan order, though this plan would ultimately come to naught. In any case, he recalls that on this trip to visit his brother, who was not yet a believer, but a somewhat restless and spiritually curious young man, accompanied him daily to Mass. He talks about how his brother drove around in an old dusty Buick, decided to take a spontaneous road trip to Mexico in order to photograph Mayan temples, and ended up investing in a cattle ranch. Both brothers were trying to find themselves. As fighting in the Second World War intensified, Merton received a medical deferral from the local draft board and finally resolved to become a monk at Gethsemani. His brother had already joined the Royal Canadian Air Force and was preparing to go to war. Before John Paul shipped out, he visited Thomas at the Abbey and expressed a desire to be baptized. Merton gave him a very quick catechesis, and he was received into the church. The next day he departed, and they would never see each other again. John Paul, sadly, was killed in action. Merton commemorated his brother with what is perhaps his finest and most personal poem, which I will read to you now. Quote, "Sweet brother, if I do not sleep, my eyes are flowers for your tomb. And if I cannot eat my bread, my fasts shall live like willows where you died. If in the heat I find no water for my thirst shall turn to springs for you, poor traveler. Where, in what desolate and smoky country, lies your poor body, torn and dead? And in what landscape of disaster has your unhappy spirit lost its road? Come, in my labor find a resting place, and in my sorrows lay your head. Or rather, take my life and blood, and buy yourself a better bed. Or take my breath and take my death, and buy yourself a better rest. When all the men of war are shot, and flags have fallen into dust, your cross and mine shall tell men still, Christ died on each for both of us. For in the wreckage of your April, Christ lies slain, and Christ weeps in the ruins of my spring. The money of whose tears shall fall into your weak and friendless hand, and buy you back to your own land. The silence of whose tears shall fall like bells upon your alien tomb. Hear them and come, they call you home." Merton's choice to become a monk may have partly indicated a desire on his part to flee the violence of the world. But his brother's death proved that he could not escape the pain and chaos all around him, even in the apparent safety of his monastic cell. This violence touched Merton deeply, because he and his brother were one. Merton's insomnia, hunger, thirst, labors, sorrows, blood, breath, life, and death belonged to John Paul. That's what he says in this poem. He believed that he and his brother, even in their suffering, were intimately united in Christ crucified. Merton's contemplation teaches him that the intensity of this fraternal bond is something that he can and must share with all of God's children all over the world in whatever walk of life, no matter their race, religion, or nationality. His love for his fallen brother is a paradigm for love as such. His young adult anxiety about what to do with his life was a crisis that only resolved when he found the peace that came from accepting his monastic vocation. But after he embraced this calling, the death of his brother and his own survival became another crisis for him, another time of decision that would require him to respond, another kairos moment. His question now was how to awaken the divine love that was already buried like a seed in the hearts of each of us. How to let this love grow so strong and unshakable that the brother-killing violence of this world would finally cease. In Merton's writings on racism, he quotes a line from the first letter of John. Quote, "But whoever possesses this world's goods and notices his brother in need and shuts his heart against him, how can the love of God remain in him?" This is from 1 John 3:17. The fact that Merton uses this biblical line to characterize Black people as brothers seems significant to me, given everything that he has written about his love for his own biological brother. Merton is arguing that white Christians, in order to be truly Christian, must love Black people as intensely as they would love a beloved sibling in need. He contends that therefore, quote, the white Christian cannot in such a situation be content merely to march with his Black brother at the risk of getting his head broken or of being shot, end quote. Even this seemingly heroic self-sacrificial act of marching together is just a start, according to Merton's powerful fraternal logic. The problem, he continues, is, quote, to eradicate this basic violence and injustice from white society, end quote. That is, if one's own beloved brother were being abused, one would not stop with mere symbolic acts of protest, however risky they might be. One would struggle tirelessly until the deepest causes of the abuse were addressed, and it finally stopped. One's level of personal commitment and involvement would be unrelenting and unquestionable. Merton's consciousness about problems of racial injustice was raised before he became a monk. While he was teaching English at St. Bonaventure College in 1940 and 41, he attended a lecture by the Baroness Catherine de Hewick Doherty, a Catholic laywoman who operated a friendship house in Harlem to serve the needs of the predominantly Black population. The Baroness argued that communists were making inroads into the Black community in Harlem because they were actually doing the works of mercy that Catholics and other Christians should have been doing. The communists were treating Black people like true brothers and sisters, making sure they had food, shelter, healthcare, and education, and fighting for their civil rights. Catholics, by and large, were doing none of these things. Merton was morally convicted by this lecture, and he decided to spend several weeks working with the Baroness in Harlem. His account of what he experienced is, on the one hand, full of compassion and righteous anger, and on the other hand, perhaps somewhat condescending and stigmatizing by modern-day standards. Nevertheless, the historian of African American religion, Albert Roberto, notes that this description of suffering in the Black community had a profound impact on the Black Panther leader, Eldridge Cleaver. Merton writes, quote, here in this huge, dark, steaming slum, hundreds of thousands of Negroes are herded together like cattle, most of them with nothing to eat and nothing to do. In this huge cauldron, inestimable natural gifts, wisdom, love, music, science, poetry are all stamped down and left to boil within the dregs of an elementally corrupted nature. And thousands and upon thousands of souls are destroyed by vice and misery and degradation, obliterated, wiped out, washed from the register of the living, dehumanized, end quote. Merton concludes that the condition of Harlem is a sign of divine judgment against the greed and prejudices of a wealthy and no less vicious white society. This point is fair enough, but his bleak depiction of Harlem leaves little room to appreciate the complex moral freedoms and strivings of the Black people, whom he paints with such a broad brush. Even as he laments their plight, he represents them as almost subhuman objects of fear. 2 decades later, in the early 1960s, Merton more helpfully identifies fear as the very root of the problem. After reading James Baldwin, he says that white races have, quote, a certain fear of the Negro, which he describes as, quote, a quasi-mystical obsession with a Black demon waiting in the bushes to rape the virginal white daughters of the Old South, end quote. Such a sexualized Negrophobia is a false mysticism. It is a violent pseudo-spirituality. It is a demonic type of ecstasy governed by affective power rather than by love or reason. And it is the greatest impediment to any meaningful practice of interracial brotherhood or solidarity. Merton argues that true contemplation is the only antidote to such Negrophobia, the sort of contemplation that would enable a white Christian to see Black people not as objects of fear, but as their brothers and sisters in Christ. But Merton goes a step further. He argues that to contemplate the true and living God, it is necessary to listen to Negro spirituals and freedom songs, and to read Black literature by the likes of Baldwin and William Melvin Kelly. He says that these works, quote, tell us that it is the Negro who hears the true voice of God in history and interprets it rightly, end quote. Merton thinks that such an openness to the presence of God and the cultural artifacts of the Black freedom struggle is a crucial step toward exorcising the demons from the hearts and structures of a white supremacist country. He is quite insistent on this point, quote, the white man has lost his power to hear any voice other than his own inner demon, who urges him to preserve the status quo at any price, however desperate, however iniquitous, and however cruel. The white man's readiness to destroy the world rather than change it is dictated by this inner demon, which he cannot recognize, but which the Negro clearly identifies, end quote. To be sure, Merton drew distinctions between different Black sources. He did not think the voice of God resonated equally in all of them. He preferred the nonviolent Christian resistant movement of Martin Luther King Jr. to the overtly anti-Christian and anti-white rhetoric of Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. Nevertheless, Merton found much to value in Malcolm X's autobiography and interpreted Malcolm's pilgrimage to Mecca as a turning point which opened him up to a more holistic sense of God's presence in the world. Although Merton worried that the Black power leaders of the late 1960s might provoke forms of chaotic and counterproductive violence, he viewed this as symptomatic of a more comprehensive problem of violence plaguing the country. He was mindful of the fact that the US had never really come to terms with its history of slavery, and that the US military was presently dropping bombs and killing civilians in Vietnam. He thought all of this was connected. He was less critical of Black nationalists than he was of white Christians who either resisted King's efforts or who naively viewed them as sufficient, as if everything had already been taken care of by the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and as if there were no further need for Black protest. Merton thought that the violence in urban slums and foreign rice fields started with white American Christians who had never dealt with the racist fears in their own hearts, who had never opened themselves up to the prospect of genuine brotherly relationships with Black people or other subjugated peoples throughout the world, and who therefore remained captive to a false and sinful version of themselves that only true contemplation had the power to unlock. In a recent essay, Gregory Hillis documents Merton's friendly correspondence with a Black Catholic priest from Louisiana named August Thompson, who had spoken out against racial injustice in the church. In his letters to Thompson, Merton wholeheartedly supports his prophetic witness and calls for, quote, a sincere, honest, and unequivocal love for Black people in the Catholic Church. Without this, Merton says, the church will fail to communicate the gospel. At the same time, he counsels even Thompson to be on guard against, quote, the violence in his own heart, suggesting that, quote, the courage that is without violence is the greatest of all because it relies completely on God, end quote. Merton viewed Black people not merely as recipients of others' love, but as human beings who must practice it themselves. So just as he might challenge his brother to grow in faith and love, so too he challenged Thompson. More than 50 years later, African Americans are still not approached with the passionate fraternal love that Merton argued they deserve. Black businesses and properties are consistently undervalued. Predominantly Black schools are underfunded. The wealth gap between white and Black Americans remains staggeringly high. While many Black neighborhoods continue to be segregated and cut off from many benefits of infrastructure, such as highways and subways, there are also new problems of gentrification that make rents unaffordable and lead to displacements of families. Water sources in some Black communities remain poisonous. Access to healthcare, including mental health care, is often unreliable, and its quality is often deficient. Incarceration rates for nonviolent offenders are disproportionately high. There are persistent problems of police brutality, including police shootings of unarmed Black men, women, and children, which have been publicized, and frequent miscarriages of criminal justice in the courts, But there's also problems of violence on the streets that don't go noticed in the papers. There are xenophobic hate crimes against other people of color, and white supremacist terrorist organizations are on the rise. Our former president, Donald Trump, had a well-documented history of white supremacist attitudes, remarks, and policies, but this did not deter millions of Christians from voting for him. While inheriting the legacies of civil rights and Black Power movements of the 1960s, new nonviolent activist movements such as Black Lives Matter have raised awareness and sought political and cultural reforms around a number of these issues. This new style of racial activism has tended to be neither Christian nor anti-Christian, neither religious nor secular. It occupies a liminal space of variously defined spiritual and material strivings, and it is arguably filling a moral vacuum left by religious institutions that have recently shown little leadership on matters of racial justice. If Merton were writing today, he would undoubtedly urge white Christians to discern the loving presence of God in such a movement. He would ask them to incorporate the grassroots struggles for Black lives into the intellectual, social, and historical fabric of their practice of contemplation. And he would insist that the very state of their souls, whether of grace or sin, truth or falsity, goodness or evil, depended on it. He would not condemn white Christians simply for being white, as if the external features of their bodies sealed their fate. Rather, he would invite them to discover and grow into truer versions of themselves. He would ask them to let their hearts and minds be filled with a Christ-like love for all of God's precious children, so that they might recognize the presence of Christ in their Black brothers and sisters and join together with them in their struggle. According to Merton, even the most catastrophic and world-shattering forms of violence are rooted in the selfish fears, desires, and choices of particular egos, which are clinging tightly to themselves instead of opening themselves up to the immeasurable possibilities of divine love. Although he recognized that the racism of the US was structural in nature, he also argued that it was a crisis for the soul of each person, who had the opportunity and obligation to do something about it. After all, who's creating these structures? Who's profiting from them? Who's running them? Merton viewed the problems as deeply heart-centered problems, as well as the solutions. Beyond the national problem of racism, which of course also had international dimensions, the type of violence that was most existentially troubling to Merton in his lifetime was the threat of nuclear war. This was an apocalyptic violence which could destroy every living creature on Earth. Its potential scope was truly global, and yet he thought its roots also lied in each one of us. It was our own inner violence, which we might choose either to unleash or to overcome. Only love, he wrote, can exorcise the fear, which is the root of all war. And he thought that this same love was the only real answer to the world-destroying power of the nuclear arms race. Today, I suspect he would say that this same love is once again our only hope against environmental catastrophe. The issue is not just warming temperatures, which might make summers more uncomfortable. The problems have to do with temperatures so hot, especially in equatorial regions, that human life becomes unlivable. Massive flooding of low-lying coastal cities and villages throughout the world, the displacement of millions of people who will lose their homes and have nowhere to go, the increased severity of hurricanes, blizzards, wildfires, and droughts, which will mean greater loss of human life, destruction of habitats, and threats of extinction for many animal and plant species, including some like bees, who are crucial for our survival, and dangerously increased levels of political and economic instability worldwide. These impacts will be felt especially by poorer and more racially marginalized communities who already suffer from higher rates of pollution and water and food scarcity. Whether it is best to talk about these problems in apocalyptic terms is a disputed question. The damage in this case does not happen in an instant like a nuclear blast. What we are witnessing is a gradual yet accelerating deterioration of life-sustaining relationships, between humans, animals, and their environments. Some forms of this damage, once they occur, are irreversible, and so there is a certain tragic finality to them. But the other point I want to make is that without the sort of ecological conversion imagined by Pope Francis, the world will continue on a path toward its own destruction. And so the crisis we are facing is truly apocalyptic. The violence within us is severing our ties with the living things around us. And it is as if we are no longer concerned to find a harmonious way to exist within the beautiful whole that is God's creation. I was pondering our ecological crisis while reading through Merton's collected poems, and I was struck by his love for the natural world around him. Contemplation was for Merton not merely a way to connect with other human beings as brothers and sisters, but also a way to experience intimate bonds with animals, plants, mountains, fields, rains, winds, and all kinds of natural phenomena. Let me read you another poem of his, this one called In the Rain and the Sun. Watch out for this peeled door light. Here, without rain, without shame, my noonday dusk made spots upon the walk. Tall drops pelted the concrete with their jewelry, belonging to the old world's bones. Owning this view, in the air of a hermit's weather, I count the fragmentary rain in drops as blue as coal, until I plumb the shadows full of thunder. My prayers supervise the atmosphere, till storms call all hounds home. Out of the towers of water, 4 or 5 mountains come walking to see the little monks' graves. Flying the neutral stones, I dwell between cedars, and see the countries sleeping in their beds, lands of the watermen, where poplars bend. Wild seas amuse the world with water, no end to all the surfs that charm our shores, fattening the sands with their old foam and their old roar. Thus, in the boom of waves' advantage, dogs and lions come to my tame home, won by the bells of my Cistercian jungle. Oh, love the livid fringes in which their robes are drenched. Songs of the lions and whales, with my pen between my fingers, making the water world sing. Sweet Christ, discover diamonds and sapphires in my verse, while I burn the sap of my pine house for praise of the ocean sun. I have walked upon the whole day's surf, rinsing thy bays with hymns. My eyes have swept horizons clean, of ships and rain. Upon lacquered swells my feet no longer run. Sliding all over the sea I come to the hap of a slippery harbor. Dogs have gone back to their ghosts, and then many lions home. But words fling wide the windows of their houses. Adam and Eve walk down my coast, praising the tears of the treasurer's son. I hang thy rubies on these autumn trees, on the bones of the home-going thunder. So I do not know how exactly to parse every line of this poem, but its joyful attention to the beauty of creation is unmistakable. The poem is wet and spacious and alive. These are not the words of someone who would turn away in apathy as the world is disfigured into an unlivable wasteland. This is a poem of one who, like St. Francis of Assisi, wishes to praise God with all of creation. Scholars of Merton who have studied this aspect of his thought more than I have confirm my intuition that Merton would see contemplation as a crucial part of the remedy we need, not only for our ongoing racial crises, but also for our intensifying ecological ones. Dan Horan discusses what he calls Merton's paradise consciousness, that is, Merton's contemplative awareness of divine goodness and beauty in the natural world, and argues that it is connected with St. Francis's celebration of other creatures, not as instruments to be used for human benefit, but as brothers and sisters in their own right. Christopher Premuk draws inspiration from Merton's 1968 journal called Woods, Shore, Desert, which contains vivid accounts and photographs of his ecological surroundings as he traveled through California and New Mexico, shortly before that fateful trip to Asia in which he died. Prevot associates Merton closely with Pope Francis's teachings on integral ecology and Laudato Si. Monica Weiss explains how Merton's 1963 exchange with Rachel Carson, the environmentalist author of Silent Spring, helped him grow not only in his love of the natural world, but also in his awareness of the threats it faced from chemicals such as DDT and from larger technocratic forces. In short, contemplation ought to help us experience our inner oneness and interdependence, not only with other human beings who differ from us racially or in many other ways, but also with the whole of creation. Is contemplation the answer to our greatest crises? That idea seems wildly implausible only because it is so profoundly misunderstood. Contemplation is falsely juxtaposed with concrete social analysis and activism. Contemplation is depicted as passive navel-gazing, a kind of self-absorption that does nothing for anyone else, and perhaps not even for those who practice it. But Merton's fundamental point, which I find persuasive, is that our embodied souls are the primary channels through which violence enters this world. And yet, at the same time, these very same embodied souls are capable of becoming living vessels of God's peace, justice, and love. Contemplation is the possibility of that transformation. Nothing stands in the way of tender fraternal relationships with other human beings and other non-human creatures, except our own entrenched resistance to them, and our refusal to be the beacons of divine grace that we already inchoately are. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Prevot, Andrew. One of the drawbacks of a virtual conference is that you don't get to hear the thunderous applause in the auditorium, which I know hopefully you felt virtually at least.
Well, silence is a fitting way to the Merton conference.
That's right, that's right. Well, hopefully, we can break some of that silence with our remaining time. We have just about a half hour or so for some discussion and Q&A. I'm going to go ahead and moderate that. You're welcome to engage in this discussion in one of two ways. You're welcome to post in the chat box. You'll see the button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And I will curate those questions. You can address them to all, or if you know how to send them to me directly, I'll take a look at that. The other thing is, if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a reactions button, looks like a little smiley face. If you click that, there's another button that says raise hand, and that will put you in a queue, and I'll invite you to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask Dr. Prevot a question or to offer a comment or response. By all means, the floor is open. I do see, and I don't know if this was directed directly at you, but we have a question in here that says, please suggest, where did it go? Please suggest one Merton book or a Merton book that explicitly links his connections of love and social involvement. So maybe, Andrew, if you have a thought about that to get started, a recommendation.
Sure, I have all my Merton books right here. This is the one collection that I've been using. It's a Passion for Peace, and it's just a really helpful kind of edited volume that brings together a lot of Merton's writings about different types of social justice issues over the years, especially the writings from the 60s. I would also highly recommend Seeds of Destruction, which contains his letters to a white liberal, which is one of his greatest works of focus specifically on racial justice issues. So I would say those two books.
Great suggestions. So we have three folks already willing to break that sacred silence you mentioned earlier. Why don't we go ahead first with David Rensberger. If you go ahead and unmute yourself to ask your question.
Thank you, Dan. thank you, Dr. Prevot, for such a wonderful address. I appreciated your tracing some of the development of Merton's thought or expressions of his thought about race from those early encounters in Harlem, where he sort of got the right tune, but he's singing it a little too loud, or is in some ways it's a little cringeworthy these days, as he has not yet gotten freed from some white misconceptions about Harlem culture, African American culture, to his better insights of later on. In reading, and it may have been Letters to a White Liberal, I noticed that Merton keeps talking about how Christians ought to love their African American neighbor as brothers and sisters, etc. I found it peculiar that he seems to simply equate Christians with white Christians. He doesn't take a large amount of account there of the Black churches as a specific instance, maybe, of the sisters and brothers that white Christians could reach out to. I don't know if you stumbled at that, or if you have any thoughts on his relationships specifically with African American Christian leaders.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think if he had lived longer, his rhetorical finesse around some of those things might have improved over time, because I think we see that development going on. I think sometimes when he says Christians, he's presupposing white Christians, but of course he is aware of Black Christian communities, and part of what he's trying to say to the white Christians is that they need to be listening to the spirituals and reading the literature that's coming out of those other communities, and he has a rich correspondence with a lot of people, but including with Black Christian leaders, and so he's really trying to walk the walk, I think, and he's not simply saying we should treat one another like brothers and sisters. He's actually trying to develop brotherly like friendships with some Black Christian leaders who were engaged in this struggle. That's one of the most fascinating aspects of the dialogue he has with August Thompson, who is a Black Catholic. And I think he's particularly concerned about the way the Catholic Church seemed at the time to be, very disengaged from these kinds of questions. So, when I read Merton, mostly I'm just very appreciative that at his time he was taking the courageous move to speak out on these things. And if he says something this way or that way that's a little bit infelicitous, it doesn't bother me in the slightest, because I can tell that his heart is really in the right place. And I think the most important thing is what is he really trying to say? And if we can all kind of also treat each other that way now, because I know sometimes people get nervous talking about race. I think if we could actually lighten up a little bit about exact wording and focus more on like what is the heart of what people are trying to communicate, I think we would be better off.
Thank you, David, for that. Next, we have Joseph Mann. I'm going to ask you to just unmute yourself, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Dan. The debate about contemplation is still ongoing in monasteries. I was on a retreat at Monastery of the Holy Spirit, Conyers, Georgia, about 10, 15 years ago. And I walked into the bookstore, and one of the priests looked at me and said, "You're not teaching them that centering prayer is contemplation, are you?" And I said, No, Father, I wouldn't dare do that. He said, "Well, go tell Father so-and-so that," one of the other monks. So the debate's ongoing.
Yes. Do you mean the debate about whether contemplation is sort of a practice that we can just do ourselves, as opposed to sort of God's grace working in our soul?
Yes.
Yeah, no, it's true. I think, and I think for Merton, it's a very, he thinks of contemplation in the same way that the great mystics and saints of the Christian tradition think of it, as primarily a work of God's grace, that's doing things within each of us. And yes, there's works that we need to do on our end to kind of prepare ourselves to receive that grace and to kind of put it to work and into action in our lives. But for Merton, it's really God's the one doing kind of the contemplation, if you will, in us.
Well, one of the other monks at that monastery wrote Merton and asked him how many times a day. And Merton, it's not the number of times.
Oh, Joseph, I'm afraid your connection seems to have been dropped there. So
maybe he could finish his remark in the chat.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that observation. Next, we have Alda Balthrop-Lewis, please.
Thank you so much for that talk. It's really great to hear, and I would love to read. I hope it's going to be somewhere. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned that there's this question in sort of contemporary environmental thought about whether to speak about the Kairos moment there in apocalyptic terms. And I think you sort of, I think your talk gave an answer to this, and I'm maybe just asking you to restate it and make it more explicit about whether and how Merton's understanding of contemplation helps us to think about that question, which is to say, so it seems like one of the things that's at stake in that question is how to live through existential catastrophe that is already ongoing. Like the thing about nuclear war is that it would happen all at once, and the thing about the thing we're going through is that it's happening all the time. It began already and it is ongoing, and we are mourning and working to arrest this like existential catastrophe that is already ongoing. And so there, like, I think that question about whether to speak of it in apocalyptic terms is one we're always wrestling with, like every day, all the time. And it just seems like a question that contemplation is particularly maybe adept at thinking through. So can you respond to that? I don't know if it's a question.
I mean, I haven't thought about whether contemplation helps us answer the question of whether this ecological crisis should be thought about in apocalyptic terms or not. All that I've been able to say here, I think, is that the crisis itself, according to Merton, is starting with a kind of violence that's inside each of us, the kind of violent relationship that we have with the natural world around us, and that therefore contemplation is really nothing other than God taking us beyond that violence to another way of life. That if we really lived into that way of life, we would start to see some of the changes that we need in this world around these types of issues. So contemplation, I think, is at least kind of a deep part of the answer that we need, according to Merton, and I would agree with that. But what I would say is that although there are ecological aspects of Merton's thought, I mean, I think in some ways I was inclined to look at the writings he did on nuclear war as kind of also a parallel to what we're facing with this kind of intensifying ecological crisis. And because it really is the life of the whole planet that's at stake. And I think what I like about having a kind of apocalyptic framing is that it shows the stakes of this. What I worry about with an apocalyptic framing is that it can feel so overwhelming that it can feel like any action we do is insignificant, and it can kind of stifle attempts to do anything, because we can just sort of feel fatalistic and despairing and sort of like, well, let's what's even the point of trying? Like, is one little plastic straw gonna like really make that big of a difference? Probably it's not, honestly. That's not the main thing. I'm not worried about straws mostly. But my point, I do think like there's something truthful in the apocalyptic framing, and we need some way to sort of have that without losing the moral agency that we also need, the sense of possibility that we also need to have, that like we actually can change. Even if it seems unlikely. I mean, I don't think Merton was particularly optimistic that contemplation was actually going to work for most people. I think he was so impressed by the level of resistance that people had in their souls for even the most basic forms of kind of inner transformation toward love. But he still believed that it was indeed possible, that we just had to tap into that possibility somehow in ourselves. And so for me, that's kind of why I think maybe, his contemplative approach to life is valuable if we're living through this kind of prolonged apocalyptic situation, because it holds the sort of seriousness of it and the possibility of it together. I'm mostly just thinking out loud here in response to your very good question, which I had not thought about prior, but that's probably the best I'm going to be able to do at the moment on it. So and nice to see you, Alda. You're in Australia right now, you must be.
She's joining us from the future. Thank you, Alda. We've got a number, as we're waiting for folks to raise their hand for live comments or questions, we've got a number of very interesting questions in the chat. So I've selected one here from Stephen Garrett, who poses an interesting question to you, Andrew. He says, can you think of a person or persons, plural, in our own day and time who have taken up the prophetic mantle that Merton embodied? I'm thinking of someone who stands in a religious tradition, Christian or otherwise, and has cast a critical eye on the injustices of our own time.
That is a really good question. I'm embarrassed that I'm forgetting the name of this person. But at the inauguration, the person who gave the kind of closing benediction, why am I blanking on his name? I have sort of pandemic brain, I suppose. Anyway, I just thought it was a very moving sermon or blessing that I will have to like relocate and follow again. But I think they're all around, to be honest with you. I mean, I think it's I don't think it's as rare as we might assume for there to be a Merton. Someone with Merton's level of awareness and sensitivity to the suffering of the world. But most of them just aren't writing as many books. They're living their daily lives in their churches, in their communities, with the kind of love that he himself was professing and striving for. And so I think I find it all around me, but I think, the dividing line between sin and grace doesn't sort of run around different groups of people, separating them off from one another, but through each of us, as the saying goes. And so therefore, anyone we might look at might also have a kind of, their own struggles that they're dealing with.
So we have some very interesting questions coming in. This one comes from Kelsey and Kevin Sheridan, who ask, your idea that Black Lives Matter and other thinkers, Adrienne Marie Brown, for example, serve a liminal space that is neither religious nor secular, but fulfills spiritual need. It's really interesting and apt. What do you see are the roots and perhaps future of this kind of, quote, liminal space?
Yeah, this is a good question. I used to have a certain allergy to the spiritual but not religious moniker because, I'm a Catholic Christian, and sometimes it felt that, my version of spirituality in that religious tradition was being kind of unfairly dismissed or prematurely dismissed by the idea that, well, a spirituality without religion is superior in some sort of way. But I've kind of gotten over that maybe immature defensive reaction to it. And now view it mainly as a sign that, we actually are, we human beings are craving something like contemplation in our lives, by whatever name we want to call it. And that when religious institutions might fail us because of their hypocrisy around various moral issues or in other ways, that hunger and that longing for God doesn't go away. So people are trying to find a way to name that and to act on it. And by the way, it's not just the hunger that doesn't go away. I think God's grace doesn't go away. Like, the Holy Spirit, I believe, is at work in people's souls and hearts in some of these social justice movements, whether they're affiliated with a church or not. And so I think as a theologian, what I'm looking for are signs of that grace. What are the kinds of actions, behaviors, thoughts that suggest to me a kind of divine inspiration, perhaps behind the scenes? And they're there. They're not hard to find. And so for me, I actually do think that unless our religious institutions can really get their act together and overcome some of the hypocrisies that are damaging their reputation, we are going to continue to see a kind of exodus of people from some of these organized religions into these more liminal spaces. But I don't think we have to despair at that. I think we can try to embrace it as an opportunity to find the contemplative life in contexts we might not have expected it to exist, and to develop it there as well, not to the exclusion of the church, but in addition.
Thank you for that. So we have Chris and Lori Prevot who are in queue there, so you can go ahead and unmute yourself, Chris.
Andrew, thanks so much for really a phenomenal presentation. I just wanted to thank you and lift up kind of your middle section on John Paul and the relationship with his brother as a kind of, I don't know, a fertile seedbed for his later notion of fraternal love or kinship with people outside his, normal circles or his tighter circles. I was so moved by your sharing the poem at the end of Seven Story Mountain, which I agree with you is one of his best. I just want to ask you, in terms of your own thinking, your own process, is there, where did that come from, that insight or that connection? Was there a moment, was there in your own reading of Merton where the relationship with John Paul kind of came into the foreground?
Well, I had read The Seven Story Mountain years ago when I was in college and didn't really know what to make of it. I found I was stimulated by different parts of it, but honestly, I found it at the time to be more details than I needed to know about this person that I didn't know much about or care about at the time. But on rereading it, I reread it a couple of years ago, and I was just deeply moved by the brother story for some reason. And to me, I was asking myself, well, what is this book really about? And I think it's really about his relationship with his brother. In terms of just the arc of the storyline, it's about his own life, but I mean, it's the climactic moment in some ways is around his brother's death and then how he has to try to process that. And I was looking at, his calls for brotherly love, fraternal love and other texts and thinking he means this really literally. And he knows, he's been through the joys and the sorrows of loving a brother in the context of a very violent world. And so I think, we can gloss over that word brotherly or brother too quickly, just with a sort of, in a kind of pious coma. But I think Merton really means it and takes it very, very seriously. Like anything you would do for your actual brother is what you should be doing for other human beings all over the world. And maybe that's an impossible goal, but I still think that that's what he was striving for in his spiritual life. So I don't know, I can't explain why it struck me in that way. I don't have a brother of my own. I have two sisters, but whom I do love a great deal. But yeah, to me, that's where the heart of it, of the Seven Story Mountain, seems to be.
Thank you for that, Andrew. This actually, one of the questions from the chat, I think, picks up on Chris's question in your response. So you may have answered this, but I want to also use this opportunity to highlight Mary Somerville's question earlier about your work, spirituality and phenomenology. And so there's a link to the monopolistic overlord book distributor, et cetera, that's in there. But you can find Andrew Prevot's book, Thinking Prayer, there, and you can buy it from the publisher if you'd like, or from your independent bookstore. But Kathleen Castles asks, she says first, thank you for an historical, biographical, informative, insightful, proactive bridging presentation. And the question is, what inspired you to take on this topic? And I heard some of that in response to Chris's question. And then she adds, thank you for your youth and commitment. I'm encouraged by your scholarship and hope more get on board. So I don't know if you wanted to add anything else about what inspired you to take on the topic today. You highlighted the brotherly part, the fraternitas. Anything else you might want to add?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks so much for all of those kind words. And you know, to share just a little bit more about myself, you know, I think I'm what might be classified as a highly sensitive person. And so I've always had a lot of sensitivity to others, including non-human creatures, but to their suffering, but also to, you know, experiences of joy. And I think that's what ultimately has kind of opened me up to trying to practice and also study and understand, you know, spiritual traditions that are trying to kind of increase that sensitivity, both for things that are ultimate, you know, the life of God, but also for, you know, the smallest things in the world. And so I think in that way, I view Merton as very much a kindred spirit. You know, I resonate deeply with what he's about. And the other piece of this is that, you know, I'm a Black Catholic scholar who's always looking for good sources to help me think through, you know, what that identity is about. And Merton's writings on racism, I just find extremely impressive for a person of his social location and his time and place. I mean, just the level of kind of courage and commitment there, to me, just has always moved me, you know, in a way where I feel loved by him because of the way that he's trying to grapple with these important problems. And so, so when I thought about putting together a talk on Thomas Merton, I thought, well, it definitely has to be about contemplation, but it also has to be about these issues that we're facing in the world, and things that, you know, maybe in particular the issues that I'm struggling to grapple with most right now, and which includes, but is not limited to, the racial justice question.
So I see Jeffrey's in the queue. Before we turn to him, Bill Simpson had written a question quite early on, and it's really an engaging one. So I want to pose this to you, Andrew. He asks, a successful negotiation presupposes that the counterpart, our interlocutor, is minimally rationally self-interested. But where we seem to be in the United States is irrational self-interest. For example, fervently believed falsehoods propagated in social media, etc. I'm personally not confident that just manifesting purity of heart and openness can punch through this level of indoctrination. So how do you think we can move forward? You know, an easy, direct question for you.
Yes, well, no one of us can do it. I mean, the contemplation is the answer if everyone experiences it to the fullest sort of extent of what it really means. But if you're a contemplative stuck in a world of people who have false consciousness and who are driven just by their kind of superficial fears and desires and lots of misinformation to boot, you know, it's difficult, and you're probably not going to succeed most of the time. But I think the question for me is, well, what is our theological anthropology here? And for Merton, and I agree with him, you know, you can never lose so much hope in another person that you assume it's impossible for them to be reached by a message of love and transformation. And I don't honestly know what it's going to take. It's extremely frustrating and it can fuel feelings of anger when it seems like people are just dug in and unwilling to even deal with facts that are presented before them. And I think that anger is legitimate, but I think Merton is right to warn us against kind of a sort of violence that it can turn into, and that somehow finding ways to respond to people with love is still, I think, the best strategy, even when it fails. And it's probably going to fail most of the time, but sometimes it won't. And those sort of miraculous moments might be just enough to kind of sustain the human spirit into the next generation, and have witnesses like Merton, available to read and engage and so on. So I don't give up hope, but I do fear that it is daunting for the reasons that this questioner is pointing out.
It's a great question. Your answer was extraordinary as well. If I may just add briefly, I'm reminded of Merton's letter to Jim Forrest with regard to the pacifist movement and nonviolence, where you basically were channeling Merton here in a way, Andrew, this idea that, success or winning cannot be the goal, right? The act of the love, as you said, has to be the goal itself, and then the rest is God, the rest is cooperating grace or what have you. So just a footnote to Jim Forrest and to Merton in the nonviolent movement there.
Yeah, thank you so much for that.
Yeah, my pleasure. So Jeffrey, if you'd unmute yourself, floor is yours.
Thank you, Dan. And thank you, Andrew, for your wonderful, as in full of wonder, presentation. I just wanted to make a comment and also ask a question. Letters to a White Liberal, whenever that comes up, I am in awe of it and what Merton did in that, especially considering it was over half a century ago, when no one else, or very few people, were even coming close to what he said. I'm thinking especially about, and you alluded to this, you were explicit about it, the fact that Black people can teach white people about white supremacy and about whiteness, white privilege, etc. And I think one of the gifts of the Black Lives Matter movement is that people are coming, I think, and this is my question to you, do you think this is happening, to a gradual, maybe too gradual appreciation of the fact that whites, we, speaking as a white male, need to learn from our Black brothers and sisters, not only Christians, but anyone, about what it means to be human. Because I think Merton really, in Letters to a White Liberal, really comes down and eventually says, to be complete humans, we have to learn from our Black brothers and sisters.
Yeah, I think so. I think that there's a lot of desire to learn now among many white people in this country. And I don't know what it was about the George Floyd protests last summer, but it did seem to break through a wall with some people, where they were thinking, oh my gosh, I have to actually start educating myself about some of these issues. I think that to just share some of my own opinions about kind of like white liberals today, I think that there still is a fear of Black people in white liberal, white progressive spaces, but the fear is not sort of the kind of like exaggerated fear of a Black rapist or criminal or whatever primarily. I think there's a fear of being judged. There's a fear of kind of saying the wrong thing and then being called out, or a fear of being sort of put on the spot and sort of blamed for things that one didn't do or what have you. And I think that my hope is that we find ways past that particular fear too, because Merton, because he was such a trailblazer, he kind of was able to work on these issues before there was such a a potential for like critical pushback from, on social media or something like that. He did get pushback from a lot of white people at the time, like including Martin Marty, who had, didn't like what he was saying and so on. But I think today there's just a fear of a kind of getting something wrong and then being yelled at or ridiculed. And so can we as a society move past that? This is what I was trying to get at earlier. If we could have any trust in people's efforts to kind of live from the deeper, truer versions of themselves, which actually go beyond our kind of racial bodies into just kind of our deepest humanity. And then to work from that place together to try to address the racial problems that we have, that I think would give me more hope than where I see we are right now. But, I could go on and on about that. So I'll let Ben ask another question.
I'm sure most of us would love to hear you go on and on, but one of the benefits of such a stimulating presentation is that there are lots of great questions coming your way. And this one comes from Tiffany Lee, who asks, can you suss out the relationship between ignorance and the violent tendencies of human nature in Merton's works? Is it a willful ignorance, or is it more fundamental? And parenthetically, she adds, as it might be characterized, for instance, in Buddhism.
Yes. I think it's ignorance and violence in both Christianity and Buddhism. But I think for Merton, it's sort of a violence that's made worse by ignorance, leading to more ignorance. It's sin is the fundamental issue, more so than ignorance, but ignorance is wrapped up in it. But I think that, it's a fine line in some ways when it comes right down to it. It's the question is, what is the answer? Is the answer wisdom or love? Well, those two things go very, very closely together. And so I think at a certain point, people are ignorant and therefore unaware of how complicit in sin they are. But the persistence in the ignorance is making that complicity worse, because there are opportunities to try to dispel the ignorance and to learn more. And often what's preventing that is not just kind of a lack of cognitive ability, but a lack of will. A fear that that kind of learning more might, you might learn things that you don't want to learn or have to wrestle with things that are uncomfortable to wrestle with. So I think there's like emotional affective aversions that people have toward learning the kinds of things that are in question here, both about racism and about ecological crises. It's much easier to just kind of go pick up a hamburger and drive your car and just not worry about it. But I think those are sort of like actions supported by ignorance that's supported by fear, that's supported by probably a sinful will.
I'm reminded too, you made mention early in your talk of the opening sequence in Seven Storey Mountain, where Merton himself talks about entering into this world of kind of sinfulness, very Augustinian in that sense. But then I can't help but think of Merton's attraction to the early desert fathers. And I think of especially, thinkers like Irenaeus, who thought of not original sin as such, but sin as a form of ignorance. So it's sorry for the theological nerding out, but I really appreciate those connections you're making. And what a great question from Tiffany Lee. Thank you for that. Gordon Oyer asks, he says, one of the many aspects of your great talk I appreciated was how you held the need for racial reckoning and justice and the need to address environmental crises together as part of a larger concern that encompasses both, rather than see them as competitors for our attention and energy. Beyond a contemplative focus, do you have any other thoughts on how we can cultivate that perspective more broadly?
Yes. Well, one thing would be to read not only works of environmentalism, but works coming out of the environmental justice movement, which in this country was largely a movement inaugurated by people of color who were finding that that their communities were being used to sort of dump toxic waste, and that they were suffering from, health issues and lots of issues related to just kind of the environmental practices. And so that environmental justice movement has already merged these issues before I ever came on the scene. So it's helpful to kind of have the terminology as you're Googling things. So environmentalism will get you certain types of results. Environmental justice will actually get you a slightly different but overlapping body of literature that I think is really important. I would also say that, the climate crisis is going to affect all of us, but not to the same degree. And this is one of the things that where we see anytime, just like COVID, anytime there's something that will affect all of us, but in different ways, the people who have the least amount of power, who are the most marginalized in our global society already, will be the ones to suffer the most and to bear the brunt of it. And that's going to be no less true of these environmental catastrophes that we're facing. So to me, the connection is just right there in the facts of the matter.
Thank you for that. I'm mindful of the time, and there are a number of excellent comments and a few remaining questions that we won't be able to get to in our session today, but I encourage folks to scroll through the chat in our remaining minutes together before our wonderful tech gurus kick us out of this virtual space.